Are you a North Carolina medical spa owner? Then listen up. The North Carolina Medical Board issued some recent guidance that could be very useful for you in running your business. Hey, I'm Morgan Davis. I'm an attorney based in Raleigh, North Carolina with a focus in health and wellness. Let's talk about how to keep your business protected and thriving. So we've talked about before that in North Carolina, we have some pretty strong limiting legislation around how a medical spa or a medical practice runs. Basically, the idea is that in North Carolina, we don't want medical practitioners making money off of medical treatment. We don't want them to be incentivized to provide more expensive treatment or different treatment or more treatment when it's not medically necessary. So in like a long line of laws that are in line with that overarching idea, one of them is that no medical entity or no business entity that provides medical treatment can be owned by anyone other than a medical licensee. That would be an MD or a PA or a physician's assistant. So medical doctor or physician's assistant. So in the medical spa world, you have a medical entity because medical spas do lots of things that are considered medical treatments. Basically anything that punctures your skin, right? So a needle, a laser, whatever, if it breaks your skin barrier, it's a medical treatment. Anything like that has to be performed by a medical entity. And that medical entity can only be owned by, again, an MD or PA. So in the medical spa world, how do we get businesses that are owned by people that are not MDs? What you often have is a relationship between a medical entity that provides the medical treatment, contracts with a non-medical entity, a regular LLC, often referred to as a management services company, that basically does everything else for the med spa, right? They do the accounting, the marketing, they might lease them the office space, they provide the non-medical personnel. Basically, they make the rest of the business run while the medical entity and the medical personnel get to focus on treating the patients. Now, nothing wrong with this legally. That very easy to make that relationship, to memorialize that relationship in legal documents and make sure that those differentiations and those sort of guardrails are there and allow these two companies to work together legally and harmoniously. But as you can imagine, it creates some confusion as to like when you're operating in a day-to-day business where two entities are in the same space within the same business or storefront to customers. What does that look like? And do lines get crossed, blurred? The answer is yes. And the North Carolina Medical Board is often the one that has to deal with those issues when things happen that go outside the guardrails. And they recently issued some guidance using a case study that I think highlights like the top 5 things to be aware of as a med spa owner. In the case study, a medical spa was owned and run by, for the majority of the time, by a non-medical person. So someone who was not an MD or a PA formed a business and was running a medical spa. And they hired a medical director who was an MD. And that medical director ultimately was called in when there was a PA who'd also been hired by the spa to do laser treatments. And some customer had some very serious facial burns from the laser treatment done on them. And they contacted the medical board and filed suit and all of those things, as one would imagine when your face is burned. And the medical director is called in and questioned by the medical board. And what the medical board finds out is that the medical director, one, had no idea about any of the other medical personnel working there, was not involved in any of the medical decisions being made by the staff working there, had been listed as the supervising physician of these medical personnel, this PA who'd performed this, as well as several other NPs and RNs working there, and had no idea. Big problem. So, however, this is a really common thing that we're seeing in the medical spa world. And so I thought we'd talk through the big 5 things that this brings up that we commonly see in the medical spa world that are technically illegal. Number 1, the medical spa structure, as I've already covered earlier, the medical entity that is responsible for looking at patients and diagnosing them and prescribing a treatment plan, that medical entity must be owned by an MD or a PA. So in this instance, the entire entity was owned by someone who was not an MD or a PA. The fact that they hired an MD to be their medical director does not negate the fact that the entity itself that's providing the treatment is not owned by a licensee, right? So that's a big no-no. You can't do that. The second big no-no is that the entity hired a medical licensee, an entity that is owned and operated by a non-medical licensee. So someone who's not an MD or a PA cannot hire an MD or a PA. So that's the next thing. They cannot employ them. How we often see that this ends up working is when you have it properly structured, you've got a medical entity that hires all of the medical personnel. And that medical entity may have a medical director. And they probably should have a supervising physician for anyone who is not a PA or an MD based on whatever kind of treatment they're offering. But the management services company hires all the non-medical personnel, right? And then they will lease or license the personnel as needed between the two businesses. But the medical entity always employs the medical personnel. Nurse practitioners and PAs are all required to have a supervising physician, and not just one in name. They are required to have a written agreement with a supervising physician, and that supervising physician needs to be practicing in a field that is related to the treatment they are providing, right? So another issue that came up in this case study is that yes, there was a supervising physician listed and there was a written agreement between the NPs and the PAs on staff, but the medical director who was listed as a supervising physician, A, had no idea that the agreements existed, and B, didn't ever meet with or supervise the staff below them who was performing the medical treatment. And it's not covered in the case study, but we have no idea if they in fact were a practicing MD in the field of treatment that those medical personnel were providing treatment in. So you've got to have, if you're an MP or a PA working in a medical spa, you've got to have a supervising physician, and you've got to have a written agreement with that physician, and you've got to meet with them on a regular basis. All of this should lead you to the idea that if you are going to create a medical spa where you've got an MD who owns it and also a management services company that's non-medical personnel, the legal structure between those two entities is extremely important to make sure that you are managing your business in a legal and compliant way. If it's not clear who works for who and how the money is flowing between these entities, then you quickly are going to find yourself in a situation where things get very confusing very quickly and get very gray, and you may end up in a position where the medical board is, looking at you for something wrong. And worst case scenario, a patient gets hurt and sues you, and now you're in a court of law trying to explain why your business is not operating in a compliant manner. So it's extremely important that the structure be built properly from the outset, and that you understand the ins and outs of it. And that structure is checked on a regular basis. Something to keep in mind, in 2023, the North Carolina legislature considered actually passing a law that would prohibit physicians from seeking or accepting payment to act as supervising physicians for PAs and NPs, meaning they could not monetize or make money being a supervising physician for an NP or a PA. The whole premise behind that was to make the medical spa industry as it acts now even harder. Because that's part of the appeal of the medical spa industry. As a physician who's operating inside a more traditional medical treatment facility, like a hospital or a, urgent care or something along those lines, an ED, whatever, you're probably making good money, but your cap is capped. You're gonna reach a certain point, and that's gonna be it. This allows physicians to make more money by supervising other medical personnel. But you can see how that might start getting into a space where if you've got an MD who's got supervising physician agreements with 100 other medical practitioners, MPs, PAs, really, really hard to imagine that MD is sufficiently supervising all of those people. That bill ultimately died. But could very well resurface, especially if we continue to see medical spa practices that operate in ways that are illegal or not compliant with North Carolina's rules on not monetizing medical treatment. So keep these in mind. Make sure that your medical spa practice is in line with the current rules and regulations. And if you need help going through this case study, give us a call. Or if you need help understanding, where you are in the current rules and regulations, give us a call.